This edition of Mac Voices is supported by MacVoices magazine, our free Flipboard magazine that brings you some of the best Mac, iPhone, and iPad productivity tips on the web. High in signal, low in noise, just like MacVoices, MacVoices magazine includes information on how you can get more out of your Apple technology. Subscribe at macvoices.com/magazine or search for MacVoices magazine in Flipboard on your iPad or iPhone. Welcome to Mac Notables on Mac Voices. This is the talk of the Mac community. I'm Chuck Joyner. Folks, for the first time since Macworld, not the show, but the magazine and website, Mr. Dan Frakes. Dan, it's great to have you back. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, it's good to be here. It's been a while.
It has been too long, and we always say that, and then we both get busy, and it happens. But you've had a few changes since we talked last, even though it's the change is now about 2 months old.
Yeah, well, as most of the people have probably heard, the much of the Macworld staff was now in other places. So we're all former Macworld editors now.
Yeah. And of course, we've talked about it here on the show, so we're not going to go too far down that path. I'd rather ask you what your plans are, what you're doing now, and where people can find you.
Well, I've been enjoying some time off, for one thing. I have to say, there's an upside to everything, right? Had some time off, and I've been recently I've been doing stuff on my own blog, danfrakes.com, where I've been writing about doing some reviews, writing about OS 10, iOS 8, things like that. And I will be starting a new quote-unquote day job soon that I can't quite talk about yet. But a lot of the stuff I've been doing over the years, reviewing products and covering technology.
Oh, that's great. That's great. So, folks, watch Mac Voices, watch my Twitter feed, because I'll let you know where Dan ends up, because Dan, your reviews are always, I love your reviews because they tell me what I need to know, but they don't get lengthy. They don't turn into 20-page reviews. They're just very concise.
Sometimes. I will admit to getting long on some products, but thank you.
Yeah. But they're always easily consumable, and I feel like I come away informed enough to make a buying decision.
Well, I think that's probably the highest compliment you can get as a reviewer. So thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. You're welcome. Well, that's great. So, at the risk of, and I'm not pushing for names or anything, but are we talking about in a week, a month?
Probably closer? In the next few days, I'll be able to say something officially.
Great. Well, we'll look forward to it.
Okay.
So that's the first thing. I guess the second thing, I've been anxious to talk to someone about iTunes 12. It seems to have created a great deal of a stir. There have been some fairly passionate outcries against it. There have been some not so passionate outcries, well, not exactly in favor of it, but maybe just saying, yeah, this is the way it's going. How do you see iTunes 12?
So far, I'm not a big fan. And a part of it, I'm sure, is that the old interface of iTunes 11 and every time Apple released a new version of iTunes, they tweaked things. And so it has changed over the years. But fundamentally, it was always similar in that you had a sidebar. Even if it was initially hidden in iTunes 11, you could reveal it. A sidebar that had all of your different types of media on the left, and then whatever the selected type was on the right. And the new one does away with that completely, and it puts it in a way that's very different. And so that is, I'm sure, part of the reason that I don't like it, and that it's a big change from something I've used for, gosh, how many years. But to me, it continues a little bit of the trend Apple has done over the last few years, where they use icons that aren't differentiated. They aren't different from each other enough to make it easy to find stuff. They've taken names away, text names. And so you've got a row of buttons, and you've got to stop every time you want to click and say, which one of those is the one I'm looking for? I think it's this one. And then once you do that, so say you click the one for movies, and then you go in, and it's just, for me, I was telling someone earlier today that I find that actions that I did quickly before are taking me sometimes 20 or 30 seconds, because I feel like every time I've got to rethink and say, okay, where is this now? And I'm sure I'll get over that. I'm sure after, a few weeks of using it, I'll get a better feel for what's where. But it just doesn't seem as obvious to me where things are. Even today, I was trying to find for the first time since I upgraded this particular computer to Yosemite, I was looking for the iTunes store in iTunes, and I was looking all over and I couldn't find it. And I realized that I've got to go into one of the categories first. I've got to pick, say, music, and then within music, click the store button that shows up then. And it seems so weird to me because I always look at the store as, here's the store. What am I shopping for in the store, rather than the way it is now, which is the opposite.
Dan, I guess I'm going to play devil's advocate here because I don't disagree with a lot of the criticism and your observations. But don't we? Well, first of all, aren't we being a little bit disingenuous, all of us? Because we've been complaining about iTunes for a long time now that they need to break things out. They need to make them, a little more segmented. I think the popular wisdom has been we'd rather not have, completely different apps for these things. And so this is a step in that direction, maybe? Is that a fair assessment?
I've heard a lot of criticisms and suggestions for iTunes over the years, but I don't think that this is. I don't think I've heard one that would lead you to this, and that, like you said, a lot of people had advocated for separate apps where you go here for movies, you go here for music, you go here for podcasts, like it is on iOS. And I mean, I guess you could argue that they've kind of done this, but in a way that I think makes it harder. I think that if we had separate apps, if there was a movies app and there was a music app and there was a podcast app, we would know exactly where to go for those. Now we open iTunes and we open it, and depending on what we were doing before, we see a different view than the last time we launched it. And then you've got to figure out, okay, now where do I go to see podcasts? And some of these things aren't even in the interface, the main interface. You've got to click a little like ellipsis button that then shows all the stuff you can't see. And so to me, it's not the kind of app that I have always associated with Apple, which is where you would open it up and say, this is where I go to do this. It's obvious where I click to do this. It requires a lot more effort, I feel, to do simple things than iTunes 11 and prior did. And again, I keep repeating this. I'm sure some of this is learning curve, and I'm getting used to it. But it's a weird interface to me. A lot of things that when Apple does things differently, I can see why they did that. That kind of makes sense. But the iTunes 12 so far, I'm just not feeling that thing.
Yeah, I mean, I wish I did disagree with you, but and the ellipsis piece, I really didn't understand that unless it's just for legacy Macs or folks with much smaller screens. But even so, I'm a little surprised that at least some of those things didn't make it out into the main interface.
Yeah.
Podcasts, I mean, that's not an Apple product. They can't sell podcasts, so I get it. But some of the other things, it just, Dan, I start to wonder if maybe, have we crossed over into an area where design has become so important and it's supposed to be so ultra cool that it's starting to become counterproductive?
I mean, there's a lot of you hear that about Apple, but then I step back and look at this, and it doesn't seem like that argument. Like I said, there's sometimes where I see an Apple product that's been changed, and I say, "Oh, I see why they would do that," but I don't look at this one. I don't look at iTunes 12 and say, oh, well, it's obvious why they've put all these things in an ellipsis menu because it doesn't even look that good from a design point of view. It doesn't look simple or elegant. It looks like there's about 3 or 4 icons that are, some of them are obvious what they do. Others, you kind of think you know what they do. And then there's an ellipsis that gives you more buttons. And that's not the kind of thing I would associate with design above functionality. That is just weird to me. I mentioned on Twitter earlier today a little bit of my frustration with the interface, and I did get a few replies from people who they liked certain things about it. For example, somebody mentioned that there's now a single menu for everything that's related to your account. So all your purchase stuff, your wish list, your iTunes account, credit balance, those things are all now in one place. And one person said that they liked that there's now a left to right hierarchy. So on the left, you choose what kind of media you're looking at. And then on the left to the right of that is like where and how, and then what view. And I can see that argument, but I think if that's really what Apple was going for, like a Finder's type column view where you've got the most general on the left, and then you get more specific. I think it could have been done a lot better than those little icons in a row at the top. So yeah, I'm not sold on it yet.
I know I was a little surprised when I plugged my iPad in for the first time to sync some stuff over to it. And yes, I do sync some things over, folks. I don't do all the over the air updates, and that's a whole other discussion. But and I was looking for what I was used to, and instead I got a wee little icon. It's like, is that okay? That's an iPad, so I guess that's it. And click it. And yeah, that in fact was it. But it just struck me as almost easy to overlook.
Right. It used to be you would plug in your iPhone or your iPad and it would immediately show up and you knew exactly where it was. And now, like you said, that now there's like that ellipsis menu, there's a little device menu and you click that and it shows you any devices that are connected. It's not obvious. I think a lot of people who aren't familiar with iTunes wouldn't know where to look and they'd connect their device and say, now what? So there's definitely going to be a learning curve here. I do hope that some of this stuff gets walked back a little or tweaked to make it a little easier to use, because right now I think that it's gone a little too far.
Okay, so this brings me to sort of a favorite topic of mine, and that is that I see it so much in the business world that companies, departments, whatever, resist change. They resist the next version of software. They resist the next version of the operating system, whether it's Windows or the Mac OS, because they just don't want to change. It's been working fine for them for 2 years, 3 years, 10 years, whatever, and they're just not interested in changing. And I understand from a comfort standpoint and a training standpoint, but at the same time, aren't you hobbling yourself a little bit by not moving ahead with the times and moving ahead with some of the new capabilities of some of the software?
I think that's true for a lot of software. I think that a lot of people do get used to what they've got and they don't want to change. And I, as somebody who reviews a lot of software and tries a lot of software, it's something that I force myself to fight against sometimes. I'll say, okay, let's give this a try for what it is, not what I'm used to. But there are instances where something is changed and it's bad, not because it's different, but because they've taken step backs or because they've made things more difficult while, with those changes. And right now, that's what I feel about with iTunes 12. I feel like it's, I guess I can kind of see where they're coming from and what they're trying to accomplish, but it feels like it's an app that's not as easy to use as it was before.
So are you an advocate of some of the tips that I've seen going around of, well, you can kind of bring back the sidebar, you can kind of do this, you can kind of do that, you can make it look a little bit like the old? Or do you think it's just better for an average user to look up and find out, okay, hey, this is how I get to the iTunes store, this is how I find my iPad when I plug it in, and just start to relearn it or learn the changes?
Well, unless you're going to use one of these hacks floating around to go back to iTunes 11, you're pretty much stuck with iTunes 12. So, I mean, you're going to have to learn how to use it. Some of the things, also, I will say some of the things here that we're talking about, I think vary depending on how much media you have, how much of a power user you are, and that sort of thing. For example, if you have a lot of music and you're going to have a lot more playlists than someone who doesn't have a lot of music. And the playlists in iTunes 12 are basically hidden. They were hidden in iTunes 11, but you could permanently turn on the sidebar with the playlist. In iTunes 12, once you go into music, you can then click on a button that says playlist, which reveals them, but then the next time you switch views, it's gone again. And those kind of things are, you can try to tweak it to make it like it used to be, or like I said, for somebody with a lot of music, to make it more useful to you, but it feels like you're fighting against it a lot. I will say that I think people who don't have a lot of music, I don't know what proportion of Apple's, of iTunes user base are those people, but people who don't have a lot of music, maybe the new view is nice because it emphasizes album art even more than iTunes 11 did, and it emphasizes movie posters, if you will, and those kind of things. But once you get more than 40 or 50 movies or 100 TV shows or a few thousand songs, I think the new view is harder to use.
How about the allegations, and I sound like we're doing the Mac jury, but how about the allegations out there that iTunes 12 seems to be pushing people more toward the iTunes radio model, more toward streaming, maybe an unnamed or unannounced yet streaming service, and getting away from the idea that you have a lot of music on your local machine. Think that's a fair accusation?
I haven't heard that argument much. What's the argument for that?
Just that because some of the things exactly you're saying, that it seems to be so difficult to do some of this stuff that it seems to be pushing you more toward a cloud model or a place where you don't have your music stored, or it's as important in the iTunes ecosystem to have your music locally, that you're going to be using a cloud service, preferably Apple's, a lot more. In fact, right, it would obviously be, and at least here, it'd be the only one. And I sort of took that, and then I went and looked at my Sonos app, and using Spotify and Sonos versus iTunes. I guess I can kind of see it. I don't feel like it's completely there, but then Apple doesn't have a streaming service that lets you really pick out exactly what you want to hear either.
Right. Yeah, and that would be kind of my response, is that maybe if Apple was more like Spotify, or if they integrated Beats into iTunes. But the way iTunes Radio is right now, it's kind of has the same issues as everything else, in that you've got to find it first. You've got to say, okay, it's in music, so let me switch to music. And it's there. Now it's the button in music to go to radio. And then it's basically the same interface you had in iTunes 11, which is, a limited selection of stations, if you will, and then any of your favorites, and then that's about it. So I don't know if I buy that. I feel like iTunes Radio and streaming music could be a lot better than Apple made them in 11, but 12 doesn't really add to them that much.
Are you a streaming music service person, Dan?
It varies. I really I do use Spotify sometimes. Every once in a while, I'll see a deal on Groupon for it or something, and then I'll subscribe for a few months. I really like the Beats service when I subscribed to it, but again, it was one of those things where I happen to listen to a lot of my own music, and so paying $10 or $20 a month for me wasn't that appealing. I have heard all these rumors that Apple's trying to get Beats down to like $5 a month, and in that case, I would definitely subscribe. I mean, there are things I like about streaming, especially when I'm sampling new music or trying stuff that older stuff I haven't heard that someone suggests to me. But right now, for me personally, I'm not one of these people who gets most of their music from streaming. I see the appeal of it, but I have a lot of music of my own.
Yeah, and I've been on this strange fence of I have a lot of music of my own, but there are times it's actually easier to get to in Spotify. And you might be able to argue that given the new iTunes interface, it's easier to access in Spotify.
That's true.
So I still find music. I still find the inconsistency of availability a problem. There's still favorite albums of mine by major artists that are not on there, and that really annoys me. And of course now, Taylor Swift is not one of my favorite artists, but now she's taken her music off Spotify, and what's next?
One of the things I do like about the stream music services is with friends, either friends or a publication I follow or a music site I follow will just send me a link to a Spotify playlist, and then I can actually. It's almost like the mixtapes we used to make, on cassettes back in the 80s and 90s, where someone hands us something and say, "Hey, here's all these things that I'm listening to now. Check it out." And you can do that on a streaming music service like a Spotify or an Rdio or things like that, whereas you can't do that in iTunes. And that's something that I really do like about these services. And I'm hoping that once Apple integrates Beats, as I assume they will, that they do offer something like that. Because I think for a lot of people I know, that's one of the big appeals of Spotify, is not necessarily that I can just go in and, find an album and listen to it, that I haven't heard before, but that I can follow playlists that other people have provided or websites have provided or publications, and then go in and listen to them whenever I want. And it's like someone shared their current favorite mix with me.
The one thing I hope somebody does, whether it's with Beats or with Spotify, and I'm pretty sure Spotify doesn't have this capability, is that because I have favorite albums that are not on there, I'd love to have the option to have an upload to that somehow, somewhere that would integrate in with the app, and so it would be available along with the music that they have. Obviously available only to me, but it would make the process a lot more seamless. I'm not looking forward to having to go through and sort and figure out what is not there. But on the other hand, if I just go and look and say,
Right.
"Oh, I want to listen to this album," and it's Spotify doesn't have it. Okay, I'll upload it, and then it's there, and it's one and done, and I never have to mess with it again.
Well, I think that's the dream of a lot of music lovers, is that you would get a combination of iTunes Match and Spotify and Beats Radio, where it all just shows up and this is what you can listen to. Here's this big pot you can take from, and don't worry about where it comes from. We'll take care of that. I think a lot of people would love to see that.
And now with this, the sound print, I mean, sorry, I can't talk tonight. iOS 8 is great. Siri is great now about identifying music. Shazam has always been great about it. So I don't think it should be any longer a matter of, well, we don't know what this song is, so we don't know who's going to get paid.
Right,
somewhere
right.
in the back end, okay, this song was played. So, but on the other hand, I've already bought it and paid for it. So
Right.
should anybody get paid?
Well, if it's not straight, well, I think that would be the way they'd have to deal with it, is that on the back end, when you play something, it would say, oh, he's bought this as part of his library, his iTunes Match. It's taken care of. But this song, he's pulling in from Spotify, or he's pulling in from Beats Radio, or he's pulling in from wherever. Then we've got to pay someone for that. And that's when that happens, it will be on the back end, and you shouldn't have to worry about it.
Yeah, you shouldn't. But I guess, well, is it going to prevent me from uploading an album that's already there? But then again, it shouldn't matter to me. I mean,
Right.
it should matter to the artist. But if the artist has already at least theoretically gotten paid for it when it was purchased,
Right.
Spotify is just delivering it back to me in the way that I want it to be delivered.
Well, I think that when this does happen, it won't necessarily be Spotify that's providing. I think what will happen is that Spotify will only provide stuff that you don't have, that you get from them. If you've bought something and it shows up in this pot of stuff in iTunes, iTunes will figure out what you own and what you don't, and what you want to listen to, whether where it falls. Does it fall out of your iTunes Match stuff? Then it's all taken care of. Does it come from Beats Radio? Then Beats Radio pays for it. Does it come from Spotify? Spotify pays for it. And I think in the best case scenario, when this happens, and I think it's got to happen eventually, you will just have a bucket load of stuff that you can listen to whenever you want, and the software will take care of who gets paid when.
And see, I guess that's where do I like the idea that if I own an album, if I've already bought it, I mean, because if I've already bought it, it's sitting in my iTunes. But if I go to Spotify now and play that album,
Right.
the artist gets paid. So is that double dipping, or is it just like the old idea that, okay, I bought the LP, I bought the cassette. If you go back far enough, maybe I bought the 8-track. Not me, but somebody did. Then we bought discs. Now we bought digital. Is it just a repackaging of the music in a digital form?
Well, in that case, currently, I mean, I think it's just one of these things where the artist is lucky that you choose to play it off of Spotify rather than off your own library, and they're getting paid. But like I said, in a perfect system, you've paid for it. It comes directly out of your library. If you didn't pay for it and you have to go into dip into Spotify for it to be played, then they'll get paid for it. But of course, we're talking about pennies here. But that's what Spotify is right now. So Spotify and RDO.
Well, and theoretically, and I don't want to take anybody's side here, but even pennies, it still amounts up to dollars, and you want the artist to get paid. There's no question about it.
You definitely do. But I guarantee that when that happens, where we get to this sort of Uber library that encompasses everything, that Apple or whoever it is that's providing it is not going to double pay.
Yeah.
They're going to say, sorry, Joe's got this one in 4 different copies in his iTunes library. You're not getting paid through Spotify for it.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. I don't know. It's an interesting problem to sort of go down that road and try to figure out. And this all came out of an iTunes 12 discussion and why we seem to be a little bit disenchanted with iTunes 12 at the moment. So I don't know. You did mention about the hack about going back to iTunes 11. Is that something you think folks should do? I mean, and because when we started that discussion, I was talking about the idea that you can try to make iTunes 12 look a little more like iTunes 11, but you were talking about completely reverting.
Yeah, there are a couple ways that are floating around the internet this week about how to essentially delete iTunes 12 completely from your system, from your Yosemite system or Mavericks, and install iTunes 11. I've heard from a couple people who've done it, and they said it works. I'd be a little leery about this. If iTunes 11 was not made for Yosemite, Apple doesn't officially support it in Yosemite. You never know when an update to Yosemite is going to break everything, and then suddenly you've got no iTunes that works. So if you're a brave soul and you want to risk it, then be my guest. But as much as I'm disenchanted with iTunes 12, I'm not going to do it myself.
Well, we're not going to solve it here, unfortunately. So I guess it's just stay tuned and see what direction it goes. Dan, another thing that happened, in fact, it just happened today as we record this, that I was really anxious to talk to someone about to get a different opinion. Microsoft let the Office apps for iOS go free. That you no longer have to have an Office 365 subscription. You don't have to buy them. Just download them and start to use them. And I guess my knee-jerk reaction, and I posted this on Twitter, is, I work and Google Docs must be eating their lunch. And, was this a desperation move, or is it more, as some of the pundits on the web have said, that this is now such an Adele as Microsoft and it's decoupling Office from Windows?
Well, I think it's both. I mean, I think it is, on the one hand, so it goes back up 10 years ago, maybe even 5 years ago, people needed Office. Whatever you did, you needed Microsoft Word or Excel or PowerPoint. And I don't know that that's true unless you work in a business that's focused on Office, that uses Office for all your work. I don't know that that's true for a lot of people. And even for people for whom it's true, I don't know that it's true on mobile. A lot of people, they can do a lot of their work on their phone or their iPad or whatever, and then they do their real quote unquote work in Office back at their desk or on their laptop. So I think Microsoft sees this, and to some extent today's release was a reaction to that, where they're like, okay, let's make it easy. Because right now, yesterday I should say, if you wanted to use Office on your phone or on your iPad, you had to have an Office 365 subscription. And the number of people who had that is much smaller than the number of people who used Office, 2008 or 2007 or whatever it was, a few years ago, when people felt like they had to have it. So, I remember back when the big worry about Mac was that Microsoft hadn't updated Office in years, and the big thing where they committed to providing a new version of Office for so many years was considered to be a lifesaver for the Mac platform. And those days are gone. I mean, yes, there are people who need to run Office, but it's not considered the kind of thing where if you don't have Office on a computer, no one's going to buy it anymore. So I think it was a desperation move on one hand. But on the other hand, you're right that Microsoft is seeing itself as more of they're seeing itself as a much more diverse company than in the past. And I think that they feel the more people that use Office, the better for Microsoft overall. And so let's just make it free on iPad and iPhone so that it makes the other versions of Office and the other Microsoft products more appealing.
Any hidden messages or meanings here with the Surface, that the Surface is not setting the world on fire? And is this possibly a capitulation by Microsoft to the iPad juggernaut?
Yeah, I'm not really sure about that. I think there are some people who see Office as the Surface's killer app, and that Microsoft shouldn't release it for the iPad because they should make it so that if people want Office, they buy a Surface. And I've not really been a fan of that approach, no matter who's doing it, because I mean, for a lot of reasons. For one, I think you're basically limiting Office. The Surface isn't doing well. We've all heard that, right? And so if you say the only mobile people who get Office are those who use the Surface, you're basically cutting off like 90% of your market right there. And it may help prop up the Surface, but it's not going to help Office or other Microsoft products. So, I'm sure there's an internal battle there in Microsoft. I'm sure there's people on the Surface team who are like begging the executives to make it so that the Surface is the Office machine. And then I'm sure there are people on the Office side saying, but there's like a tablet with 70% of the market that people want, and they want our software for it. Why aren't we giving it to them? So I would fall on their part of the half of the argument, in that I think the more people that use Office, even if it's a free version on an iPhone, the better for Microsoft.
Yeah, the one thing that did surprise me, I guess, was the decoupling from Office 365. As hard as they're trying to push that. So I guess, and you said it earlier, if you're using an older version, I don't know the compatibilities. I haven't done that kind of research yet, but it's just that they were trying to do this almost as a whole package, that if you bought into Office on the desktop, you were buying into it on all of your iOS devices. And those are some pretty good apps too. If you're going to use that environment, it's a pretty good environment to use it. So was that, I mean, how significant was that they took it away, that they decoupled it from Office 365?
Well, it's sort of along the similar lines, I think, in that by making it only for people who had Office 365, they were limiting the number of people who were going to buy it. Because what about the millions of people out there who were using Office 2011 for Mac, Office 2010, was it 10, the previous one for Windows? All the older versions. I'm even on one of my computers, I have an Office 2008 that works perfectly fine for most of the stuff I do. The same with people at my wife's company. So all of those millions of people using older versions of Office couldn't use the mobile version of Word and Excel because they hadn't subscribed to Office 365. That always rubbed me the wrong way, and not only from a user standpoint, but from a business standpoint, in that why are you limiting your market and forcing people to not use your good software that you spent all this time developing? So I think it makes sense for them. I think that Office 365 is going to continue to be their premium product. It's the one that businesses use, and that's where they make most of their money. It's the one that people who need the latest features use. It's the one that includes, cloud storage and all these features that aren't available elsewhere. And then they make the iPad and the iPhone versions free for anybody who wants to use them. I think that's only going to help Office in the long run.
Yeah, I would agree. Usually, you feel like when somebody makes something free, it's either past its prime or there's a secondary agenda, which I think is the case with Apple and iWork. That they're trying to promote the whole platform. So that's why I guess this just really struck me as a big surprise. But from what you're saying, there's certainly some logic to it.
Well, and I think that this is sort of Microsoft's response to iWork, right? I mean, iWork exists to push the platform and to get people to use iOS devices. And free Office for iPad and iPhone exists to get more people using Microsoft software. I mean, Apple's trying to sell the hardware, Microsoft's trying to sell software and services, but I think they're basically serving the same purpose here. And honestly, I think that the Office apps for iOS should have been free from the beginning for the same reason Apple decided eventually to make the iWork apps free.
Yeah, I agree with that, which, you have to wonder. I don't know that it's too little too late, but it certainly, I think, could have cemented their position a lot earlier or undone a lot of damage that has been done to their market share on the mobile platforms if they had done this earlier. But
there's no doubt about that. I mean, people have spent the last 5 years trying to figure out how to open their Office docs on their iPhone or their iPad, and a lot of people have already figured out workflows or just said, forget it, I'm not going to do it. And now we've got a good version of Office on the iPad, and people have to decide, well, did I really need it? I mean, I've kind of gotten past that now. And some people will jump at it and say, okay, definitely this is what I've been waiting for. But other people are kind of like, I don't really need it anymore.
Yeah. I know that there's times I still have to have it on the desktop, but
Yeah, right.
now my workflows are gone the other direction. You've hit it exactly, that I don't, okay, so it's there, fine, but I don't need it.
Right. But for the people who do work in office heavy environments, especially people in business, in education where they use that, this is huge. I mean, it's a big thing, because now they can do all the stuff that they had to go back to their office to do before. And so don't get me wrong, there are people for whom this is a huge deal, but I think it's a huge deal to fewer people than it would have been 5 years ago.
Agreed. Well, the last thing I wanted to make sure we got to is a little piece of hardware that you picked up.
Oh, yes.
That I'm massively jealous of. You picked up an iMac 5K.
Yeah. I think it seems like a requirement that a bunch of the people who used to be at Macworld had to go buy one the same day. We all got together, and but no, it's I actually got it a few weeks ago, and it took me. I was so busy with different things that it took me a couple weeks to actually get it all set up, and so I just been doing that this week. And you were kind of asking me before we started here, is it all that it's been hyped up to be? And I have to say, in terms of, well, I was jumping from a 2010 iMac, and then I've used a 2013 iMac. This is in terms of performance, it's a huge jump, obviously, from the former. Over the 2013 iMac, the performance it's a little better, but fairly comparable. But that's not to belittle that, because it's very fast. I mean, it's great. I got the i7 model, and I got a bunch of RAM, and it's been fantastic in terms of performance. But clearly, the screen is the thing here. And the interesting thing is that I had some discussions with people who, like, well, but you're not a photographer. You're not doing 4K video, and my response is essentially, have you looked at text on a Retina screen before? Because honestly, it's night and day. I mean, maybe that's overstating it a bit, but when you sit at a computer as much as I do every day, working with text, the difference it makes is huge. It's what I would go from my display that's not Retina to this display, and it was immediately obvious how big of a difference there was in how clear text is. There's no jagged edges. There's no fuzziness. It's just crystal clear. And just looking at the text, it's easier on the eyes, and it's easier to read, and it's a joy to use, even if all you do is text.
Wow, that's a pretty strong recommendation.
I didn't think it was going to be that big of a deal. Our friend Jason Snell, he did his review of it before I took mine out of the box, and he made a bunch of comments about text. And I have to admit, I was like, yeah, I can see that. I mean, I remember going to a Retina screen on my iPad and iPhone, and it was nice, but I don't think it's going to be that huge of a deal on a 27-inch display. And I was totally wrong. I mean, it really is. Web pages, Twitter, even, text, even working in BB Edit, which is where I do most of my writing, everything is just clearer and easier to read.
So if we're going to do social media, we have to have a 5K display. Is that it?
Makes Twitter so much better.
Yeah.
No. So I think that it's a fallacy that you have to basically be doing like high-end photography or 4K video. I think that the exact opposite of that, even if all you do is text, you're still going to see a huge benefit from these screens. And so I'm actually looking forward to the day when these are things that everybody can buy and not have to buy a $3,000 iMac to get.
Yeah, but it's, and this has been said a million times, but the 5K, 4K, 5K displays are as much as the iMac. And so you kind of get the iMac thrown in for free.
Oh yeah. And that's why I bought it, because I had a 4-year-old iMac, and I wanted to, I wanted to upgrade, and I said, hey, I use my computer every day, 10 to 12 hours a day. It's the tool I use more than anything else. So if I can't justify spending an extra $1,000, every few years on a better screen, then that's crazy. So, I jumped at the chance to do it, and I'm glad I did.
Yeah, that's great. How about the speed? As you said, it's a little bit of an improvement, and I gather that that's not a big deal with what you're doing, primarily text.
Well, I test a lot of software. I have a lot of stuff running it. My 2010 iMac was it was a lesson in frustration for me a lot of days because it was just getting old and slow. And the Retina one over that one is a massive difference. I mean, everything is faster on it. It's night and day. Going from 2013 to 2014 iMacs, there is a difference. It's noticeable, but it's not huge. I think that if it weren't for the screen, it wouldn't make much sense to upgrade from a 2013 to the new iMac because they're basically the same internally. The speeds have bumped a little bit, but that's about it. You're really upgrading from last year based on the screen.
Well, something. Oh, I know what I wanted to ask you. You were saying that 2013. Was your 2013 Fusion Drive?
Yes.
Okay.
So I have Fusion Drive on both of them, and to some extent, Rob Griffiths and Kirk McElhern and Jason Snell, they all got Fusion Drive. I mean SSDs, just straight SSD, and I went with a 3 terabyte the Fusion Drive just because I wanted the space. And part of me regrets that a little bit because it supposedly is a noticeable difference between the two, but we're talking between my 2010 and this and a Fusion Drive. I mean, an SSD. I think that there's not a huge difference, given how much of the speed bump I just got for upgrading anyway. But the Fusion Drive is fast enough. I mean, I can tell when I'm writing to and from the hard drive versus the SSD inside. But overall, I've had Fusion Drives on my iMac since, well, that 2010 iMac, actually, I installed a Fusion Drive on it a couple of years ago. So I've been using the Fusion Drives for a few years now, and I like them. They're a good compromise between speed and space.
Yeah, and the prices keep coming down, which you got to love.
Well, they Mac Sales, OWC, just today announced 1 terabyte upgrades for the MacBook Air SSD, 1 terabyte for like $540, for $49, something of that sort. And I remember, was it just a year and a half ago or so? That would have been like $1,200.
Yeah, I missed that. That's
they just this morning.
Wow. Well, never mind. I won't get into my personal. I'll go look it up myself.
It's for the 2010 to 2012 MacBook Air.
Oh, that's nice.
It's $549 for 1 terabyte solid state drive.
Well, thanks, Dan. You just cost me money. Wow, because that's always been kind of the argument against the Air was the limited space, and if you could upgrade to that.
Well, I upgraded a few months ago my 2012 Air from the stock 128 to a 256 for like it was like $170 or something, and so now I'm like, wait, for $540, I could have got a terabyte.
Yeah, but you know how it'll be. The next year or 6 months from now, it'll be down another 15 or 20%. It's the way things go. Yeah. And I don't know about you, but I think we all hoard too much, and I'm guilty of it with multiple Drobos sitting here. So I have no room to accuse anybody.
Yep.
So those are the main things I want to touch on, Dan. Anything else that has been exciting in your life that you've come across that you just can't stand not to share?
I can't think of anything off the top of my head. I've been spending much of my time over the last couple of weeks enjoying some time off, writing stuff for the blog, and cleaning up my office, which hasn't had a good clean out in about 5 or 6 years. So that's been my life recently.
Yeah, that's judging by what's behind me. I have one of those coming myself. So we'll get you back here again, hopefully sooner rather than later. Next time, flying a new flag for someone, and looking forward to hearing all about that and seeing what comes next in the Apple world.
Good. I look forward to coming back.
Great. It's great to have you, Dan. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Chuck.
Folks, I'm Chuck Joyner. You can follow me on Twitter. Dan, what are you on Twitter?
Just Dan Frakes.
Just Dan Frakes. Okay, so follow Dan on Twitter. And Dan also did a great iOS 8 article I flipped into the new MacVoices Flipboard magazine that I'd love to have you go and try out. So you can go to macvoices.com/magazine, find all all about that, and also find Dan's article. Until the next time, and as always, thanks for watching. Visit MacVoices.com for links, show notes, to subscribe, to connect with Chuck on Twitter, Google+, YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn, and the MacVoices blog. Subscribe to our weekly newsletter, the MacVoices Dispatch, to stay up to date on all the latest MacVoices news from our front page or at MacVoices.com/newsletter. Do more with your Apple tech by subscribing to the free MacVoices magazine on Flipboard by visiting MacVoices.com/magazine. Advertising and sponsorships handled by Backbeat Media at backbeatmedia.com. Bandwidth provided by CashFly at cashfly.com.